Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, House Speaker Paul Ryan, and the two leaders of our tax writing committees, Chairman Orrin Hatch and Chairman Kevin Brady, who've been working on tax reform for months with our Secretary of the Treasury, Stephen Mnuchin, and Gary Cohn, our National Economic Council Director. Since the day I took office, we've added 1.2 million private sector jobs, and a lot more than that if you go from the time we actually got elected November 8th, including 125,000 manufacturing jobs, and we just had another very good month for manufacturing and the jobs. You probably all saw that. But if we're going to keep this momentum going and allow the economy to truly take off as it should, it is vital that we reduce the crushing tax burden on our companies and on our workers. We pay the highest tax of any country in the world on businesses, and we can't keep doing that. Last week, I repeated my principles for tax reform. First, we must make the tax code as simple as possible. It's extremely complex, it's not fair, and it's extremely hard to understand. So we want to make it as simple as possible. Second, we must provide tax relief for middle-class workers and families. Third, we must restore a competitive edge, which we've lost. We're doing fine, but we lost the competitive edge. You see what's going on all over the world. So we can have real job growth throughout America. We can't be the jobs magnet of the world if we continue to tax our industries at rates 60% higher than companies in other countries. Can't do it. And finally, we must bring back trillions of dollars that are currently parked overseas. We have, in my opinion, $4 trillion. $4 trillion. Massive amounts of money that can't come back to our country because of our tax code and because of the rates. And this is more than just tax reform. This is tax cutting, to put it in a very simple term. We're going to cut taxes. We're going to reduce taxes for people, for individuals, for middle-income families. We're going to reduce taxes for companies, and those companies are going to produce jobs. Tax reform that follows these principles will create millions of new jobs and ensure that more products are stamped with the very beautiful letters and words, "Made in the USA." It's time to lower our taxes, bring back our wealth, and make America the jobs magnet that it can become. And pretty quickly, it's really, in other words, an expression, I don't know if too many of you have heard it. It's time to make America great again. Has anybody heard that expression? I don't think so. So that's what we're doing. We're making America great again. You see it in the numbers. You see it with jobs. You see it with companies moving back in. They're moving back in at very, very big numbers. They're coming back into our country, and you haven't seen that for a long time. So we're very proud of that. So we're now going to discuss tax reform and tax cuts, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you, everybody, very much. Thank you.
Mr. President, how is the DACA decision treating journalists with heart?
Well, I have a great heart for the folks we're talking about, a great love for them. And people think in terms of children, but they're really young adults. I have a love for these people, and hopefully now Congress will be able to help them and do it properly. And I can tell you, in speaking to members of Congress, they want to be able to do something and do it right. And really, we have no choice. We have to be able to do something. And I think it's going to work out very well. And long term, it's going to be the right solution.
What do you say to your opponents?
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
There you have President Trump in the White House taking some questions on one of the biggest headlines of today, of course, his administration's decision to end the DACA program, that is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, shielding many young Americans who were brought here undocumented with their parents as they were children. I want to talk a little bit about what he was talking about there, tax reform, and also those headlines today, the reaction they're getting on Capitol Hill and beyond. Joining me down in Washington, D.C., my colleague John Verhoeven joins us live there. John, let's talk a little bit about that DACA headline first. Of course, 800,000 futures put up basically on the gambling blocks. President Trump is asking Congress to act, to take this up now and make something happen to potentially provide some certainty for all those young residents here. Are we starting to hear from members of Congress about what they could possibly do?
Well, we are, and I think we're starting to see sort of the battle lines get drawn in Congress. You've continually had this split between, you know, the more conservative wings of Congress, sort of the Steve Kings, the Freedom Caucus members, and those more moderate and leadership members who want to see something done on immigration reform, but have really been put between a rock and a hard place by this president when it comes to an issue like this. He had very strong rhetoric on the campaign trail, and now you see a president, and you saw him there, who feels sort of conflicted about this and always wants to emphasize that he's approaching this issue with great heart and a lot of thought. But the reality is this is a very politically fraught issue, and I think a lot of Republicans in Congress realize that, and I think they realize this is a tough road ahead on them.
This really sets the clock ticking, though. We should note with this 6-month deadline that's basically landed on their laps, as much as the president and Attorney General Jeff Sessions, when he made the announcement earlier today, invoked compassion and heart. You're talking about real people's lives, right? They have families. A quarter of them now have kids. 60% of them have an American citizen sibling here. Many of them are married to American citizens. We saw two of the guys there sitting next to the president who are going to have to lead this charge, right? Speaker of the House Paul Ryan and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Have either of them weighed in now on whether they're even going to be able to take up the issue of DACA and immigration reform?
Well, in his first remarks since coming back to Congress, you saw Senator McConnell on the Senate floor did not talk about DACA. His main priorities are making sure the government is funded, making sure that the aid for the victims of Hurricane Harvey is passed, and basically just getting the government funded. And if you really think about it, I mean, to think that tax reform or any other big issues are going to get done. I mean, in just looking at Congress's to-do list, you have Harvey aid, you have funding the government, you have tax reform. Nobody's even talking about health care anymore. There are so many issues. And you saw Speaker Ryan, when he put out a statement, sort of being cautiously optimistic, but I think he realizes, and I think he realizes this, from the healthcare fight and from many other fights, that this is a politically fraught issue. It's not going to be an issue where he has broad agreement in his caucus, and I think Senator McConnell also realizes that he has a lot of divisions within his own caucus as well.
Oh my God, John, healthcare feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah, I know.
By the way,
Yep.
But you're right. I think there are probably lessons from that they're trying to pull as they're
Right.
moving ahead and figuring out strategy. In case anyone missed it, I just want to replay something from earlier today, because this was such a big announcement that's going to have repercussions for so many people. This is Attorney General Jeff Sessions earlier today making this long-anticipated announcement to end the DACA program. Here it is.
I'm here today to announce that the program known as DACA that was effectuated under the Obama administration is being rescinded. In other words, the executive branch, through DACA, deliberately sought to achieve what the legislative branch specifically refused to authorize on multiple occasions. Such an open-ended circumvention of immigration laws was an unconstitutional exercise of authority by the executive branch. The effect of this unilateral executive amnesty, among other things, contributed to a surge of minors at the southern border that yielded terrible humanitarian consequences.
So there you have it, that historic announcement made this morning. We're going to unpack it a little bit more as we move along here. But John, while I've got you, let's talk about what the president was talking about right there. Also, along with his key campaign promise to end DACA, he has been promising tax reform. A huge tax reform project, he says, sweeping tax reform, sweeping tax cuts. What are the chances this moves ahead in the way the president wants it to?
Right. I think from the way you see President Trump talking, you see some administration officials talking that they think that this is an issue that could be a winner. But I think a lot of people, if you really get into the issue, realize that tax reform is also an incredibly difficult issue politically. And I mean, this has definitely been an issue. I think Trump, obviously, he portrays himself as the businessman president, and the economy is really, he strives for that to be his bread and butter. But, like I said, there's just so many divisions laid bare among the various legislative fights that we've seen in Congress over the last couple of months. And I think tax reform is going to be no different. I think you're going to see a split, in the House among Republicans. I think you're going to see Democrats, wanting to come to the table, but also realizing that, probably the proposals that are going to be put out there are pretty far, from the legislation that they're looking for. But, I think this is an issue that President Trump cares a lot about, and I think he realizes matters a lot if he, wants to continue to portray himself as this business brand president, as this great negotiator. But, I think the reality is that it's going to be very, very tough to get something passed.
Well, already, if you look at the road that's traveled so far, the initial estimate from those leading the tax reform project was that they wanted it done by August. We passed that. Then they said
what's
they'd
the date
like
today? A little late.
We're splitting hairs. But look, they wanted it done by August, and they said, okay, that's not going to happen. Now they want it done by the end of the year. You were just talking about the congressional calendar as it is laid out. And the leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, kind of hinted at what his priorities would be. Tax reform wasn't on that list.
No, and I think that, I think Mitch McConnell realizes that time goes a little bit faster in Washington, especially on the Hill, when it comes to what realistically can get done. These are not issues, and especially now that in reforming DACA, the president and the White House seems to be advocating for a more comprehensive plan. That's a long process. And so I think Mitch McConnell, and this goes back to when Mitch McConnell a couple of weeks ago, said the president has unrealistic expectations about how quickly things can get done. And I think this is just another prime example of, this president wanting to put pressure on Congress and wanting to light a fire under them, but Congress sort of trying to pump the brakes and say, look, Mr. President, we have certain things that are need to get done, and then there are want to get done. And I think that, I think tax reform and I think immigration reform are things that are sort of want to get done, or on the wish list for Congress. And who knows how President Trump will react to that.
Well, they're pumping the brakes, but it seems like they're also asking for some guidance, i.e. tell us what it is you'd like us to create that you would sign off on. And there's a little bit of a parallel here between what we're seeing with DACA and with tax reform. We saw Senator Chuck Grassley come out and say, look, tell us what you'd like to see with immigration reform. So if we try to craft something, we know when it gets to you, you're going to sign off on it. I mean, you look at tax reform. I mean, the last time we went through any kind of big sweeping tax reform in this country was 1986, right? With President Reagan. Back then, Reagan sent hundreds of pages to Congress and said, take a look at this. These are some ideas for the kinds of things we'd like to see. Work on it and get back to me. Have we seen anything like that from this administration? Right.
I think the one thing that we've seen, I think there was a one-pager a couple months ago that the White House put out. They centered a briefing around the issue. But you're right. You don't really see the White House taking a policy lead on that. And you saw in the briefing today, Sarah Huckabee Sanders was adamant. I mean, I was watching and I was counting how many times she said the word Congress. I think she got up to, 17 or 18 times. And I think that really tells you that, President Trump, wants to portray himself as a negotiator. He's not a legislator. He's not, going to sit in the Oval Office and write a tax reform bill himself. And I think that's unrealistic to expect a president to do. But it is a little bit strange to see the White House not really taking the lead on this. They are really passing the buck, and they can advocate for it and they can emphasize it. But they really are saying, look, Congress, these are the things we want you to get done. We're going to push for it every single day, but it's up to you in terms of what this legislation looks like. So it's a bit of a strange phenomenon, but I think it's one that we're going to continue to see with this White House.
All right, let's bring in our colleague Mary Alice Parks, who joins us over on Capitol Hill now. Mary Alice, you spend your days talking to a lot of these folks, these leaders on Capitol Hill. If the administration is not going to give them the guidance or the details, are people there willing to step up, fill in those details, and take action when it comes to both DACA and tax reform? Two things now the administration says they want Congress to handle that don't seem to be priorities for them right now.
What I found so interesting today was that you saw both Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill saying that a standalone DACA package would likely pass. The question is, will Republican leadership bring that up for a vote? And would the White House sign a standalone package? You know, Sarah Sanders was specifically asked that repeatedly from the podium today. She wouldn't say one way or the other. Would the president sign just a DACA package, or would it need to include more robust immigration reform, wall money, border security, other funding? And so it'll be really interesting to see if there's enough pressure from kind of the rank and file across Capitol Hill for Republican leadership to bring just a DACA package to a vote.
You know, Mary Alice, it's a really interesting point you raised, because if it were just about the lives of those 800,000 dreamers, you would think a standalone package would be enough. But that point you referenced from Sarah Sanders earlier today is worth revisiting. Take a listen to the answer she had to give when she asked what the White House would like to see when it comes to immigration reform.
There are many Republicans who believe that getting something on the Republican side is not going to be easy, that the divisions that we see between the center and the right in the Republican Party will become only deeper. What gives you confidence that this
With
can
all
actually
due respect,
happen?
I don't think the American people elected Congress to do things that were easy. They elected them to make a government that works, to work properly, and to work for American people, and that's their job. And if they can't do it, then they need to get out of the way and let somebody else who can take on a heavy lift and get things accomplished.
You know, Mary Alice, the point is not wrong, right? They are there to legislate. They control Congress. But when you look at history, and if history is a guide, the Republicans haven't been able to even bring themselves together on something like health care reform. So is there any hope for immigration reform or tax reform moving forward as things stand right now?
You're right. History is not a good indicator that this Congress is going to be able to get some of these big ticket items done. You know, something like health care reform, like you brought up, that was a key campaign promise they couldn't even unify around, let alone immigration reform, which was far from the top of the list. But it's interesting, this idea of there now being a deadline. You know, Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the most outspoken Republicans on the issue, said that maybe a deadline could help, that could motivate everyone to come together and make sure they get something done now. That's true. We've seen that happen in the past. It's also really interesting, this unique moment. The month of September, Congress has to pass funding bills. They have to figure out how to keep the lights on in the federal government. They have to raise the debt ceiling if they don't want the country to default. And in order to pass those pieces of legislation, they're probably going to need Democrats' votes. So it'll be really interesting if Democrats really use that leverage to push some of these issues, push DACA, push changes they want to see on tax reform, if they know those are things they could pass.
Hey, John, over in our D.C. bureau, the optics here are worth revisiting for just a second, because with the administration's move today, they basically passed the buck over to Congress. If for any reason Congress is unable to act to provide any kind of certainty or path forward for the 800,000 dreamers who are currently sort of in this system, right? They've handed over all their information to the government. They've trusted the government regardless of party or politics or president. If Congress can't do it, can the White House legitimately say, well, it was on you, we can't do anything here?
It's a very good point, and I think it points to why, you know, when you listen to a lot of these students and a lot of these people in this country that have benefited from this policy, they're very unsure. They honestly don't really know the answer to that question, and it sort of begs the question of why now for this White House, and you know, when you have so many other things going on. And I think it does go back to the fact that, you know, this, you know, I think President Trump views this as, in the end, something that will be beneficial for him politically. But it's a very good question. You know, I don't know the answer to that, but I think you're going to see, you know, again and again and again, President Trump and this White House make the case that this is now Congress's issue. It's not something that the White House is going to take the lead on, even though they are the ones that sort of initiated this whole process.
So, Mary Alice, let's talk about how this actually moves forward now. Healthcare reform was a huge turning point for so many Republicans. For 7 years, they were campaigning on repeal and replace, repeal and replace. Was there anything learned? Are there lessons that the leaders there in both the House or the Senate are carrying forward and trying to push through the things that they need to get done to keep the lights on, to keep things moving forward, let alone tackle some of these big ticket items?
Yeah, they're trying to coordinate more, especially on tax reform. We're seeing that, some real coordinated messaging from the White House and Republican leadership on Capitol Hill. That's a clear lesson learned from what happened with health care. And it looks like with DACA, with this decision the president made, he at least gave Republican leadership some heads up. You saw statements sort of pre-written, ready to go for press aids, ready to press send. That was something that has been a constant complaint up here on Capitol Hill. You had lawmakers feeling caught off guard time and time again from this president and this White House. So I think that there has been a little bit of a learning curve. They're trying to make some adjustments, and we'll probably see a more coordinated effort this fall. But you know, it's interesting that point you were talking about with Johnny earlier, whether the president will be able to successfully wash his hands of this. And I just find that really hard to believe. It just doesn't tend to work that way. The presidents in the past have tried to kick the can to Congress, and at the end of the day, they're the ones there in the White House. The buck stops at the top.
All right, Mary Alice Parks, John Verhoeven, good to talk to you guys.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for watching as well. Remember, you can go to abcnews.com anytime for the latest on all of those stories and many more. For now, I'm Amna Nawaz, and I'll see you back here soon.